Shalom and welcome to Simchat Yisrael. Today's Parsha is Naso, and in it is contained one of the most difficult and uncomfortable passages in the Bible. The details of the Sotah Jealousy ritual found in Numbers chapter 5. If you're not familiar with this passage, it basically goes like this. A man becomes suspicious that his wife has been cheating on him with another man. He has no proof that his wife has been unfaithful. All he has to go on are his feelings of jealousy. So the husband then publicly accuses her of adultery and brings her to the temple to perform a ritual to prove her guilt. The woman is brought before the priest and has her hair uncovered and loosened. Not a big deal in our society, but in communities where keeping your hair covered is a sign of modesty, this is the equivalent of being stripped naked. The husband makes an offering to God, and then what almost seems like a magic spell happens. The priest fills a bowl full of holy water, then mixes dirt from the temple floor into it. The priest then writes on the parchment that if the woman has been unfaithful, then God will curse her. He will cause her belly to become swollen and her insides to rot. The woman must agree to this curse, and then the priest mixes the parchment into the dirty water, and then the woman has to drink the foul concoction. If the woman is guilty of adultery, then immediately the waters will become bitter inside of her and cause her to rot from the inside out. If she is pregnant with another man's child, the child will die, and she will be accursed among her people for as long as she lives, which is likely not a very long time. The woman will bear her guilt, but her husband will be free of guilt. Pretty nasty stuff, right? Even apart from the hideous death, it just seems so humiliating. It evokes memories of the book, The Scarlet Letter. In that story, Hester Prynne is found guilty of having a child out of wedlock and is forced to parade through the town with an A for adulteress embroidered on her clothing. Has to stand in the town square being jeered at by the crowd. The Sota ritual itself calls to mind the medieval trial by ordeal. In these trials, the accused would be forced to do dangerous and painful things, like walk across a bed of flaming coals, or reach their hand into boiling water, or hold a red-hot stone in their hand. The idea was that if he was innocent, then God would cause a miracle to happen and he would be unharmed. You can guess how these trials usually went. Maybe the worst example is the cold water trial. During witch hunts, the accused were bound hand and foot and thrown into a pond. If they floated, that meant they were so evil that the water itself rejected them, and they were dragged back to land to be burned at the stake. But if they sank, that meant they were innocent, but by then they'd already drowned. Is this what the Bible teaches? To brutalize the weak? To treat our wives like property? To resort to superstition and mysticism when dealing out justice? Or is there something deeper going on here? The Sota ritual does sound like magic. It's deeply symbolic and very difficult for a modern reader to wrap their head around. So let's create a contemporary hypothetical situation based off of Talmudic teaching to illustrate how the Sota ritual might be used today. The rabbis took great pains in specifying the exact circumstances under which a Sota ritual could be performed. Certain circumstances have to be met before a husband is allowed to make such serious accusations against his wife. So let's get to the scenario. This is Sarah. She's married to Lenny. They have a happy and successful marriage, but lately things have been rough. Sarah works at a downtown office, and in recent months has become friendly with one of her coworkers, Bob. Sarah and Bob eat lunch together every day, talk on the phone often, and have started to spend time together outside of work. And Lenny isn't feeling good about this. He feels that Sarah and Bob's relationship is undermining the specialness and exclusivity of his own relationship with his wife. Lenny asks his rabbi what to do, and the rabbi tells him that the Talmud states that he should confront his wife about his feelings, and do so in the presence of two close trusted friends, so that there will be witnesses to the talk, and to ensure that there are people to intervene in case things get heated. Lenny takes the rabbi's advice, and in front of their friends, Joe and Jane, he asks Sarah not to be alone with Bob anymore. Sarah agrees that she won't see Bob anymore, and the issue seems like it's resolved. But a week later, Joe and Jane are out taking a walk, and what do they see but Sarah and Bob together? They follow them for a bit, and to their dismay, they see Sarah and Bob walk into a hotel. They feel obligated to go to Lenny and tell him what they witnessed. Lenny is distraught and he asks them, are they sure? Did they actually see the adulterous act? Joe and Jane have to admit that they didn't actually witness any adulterous activity. All they saw was the opportunity for adultery. So once again, Lenny confronts his wife. He tells her what Joe and Jane saw. Sarah admits, yes, she went into the hotel with Bob, but it was only to have lunch at their restaurant. She swears she didn't do anything else with Bob and that she has been faithful to her husband. Lenny and Sarah are at an impasse. Lenny has good reason to be jealous. Sarah continued her relationship with Bob even after her husband asked her to end it. Sarah insists that she's been faithful, but she doesn't have anything other than her word to prove it. What is this couple to do? There are a few options that might play out. Lenny and Sarah might not want to disrupt their lives with a messy divorce, so they might continue on with their marriage, but harbor ill feelings and mistrust towards each other. They would sleep in separate bedrooms, cease to communicate with each other, and any lingering love they had would slowly fade away. Or maybe the anger and betrayal that Lenny feels over the situation will lead him to mistreat his wife. He might speak cruelly to her or seek out his own affair to even the score. Since two wrongs don't make a right, rather than leveling the playing field, Lenny's wrongdoing will just drive the wedge between himself and Sarah even deeper. Or maybe the two of them will just give up on the idea that a monogamous relationship is possible. They might just agree to turn a blind eye to each other's affairs and just come to accept that cheating and unhappiness is part of their marriage. It should come as no surprise that none of these alternatives are acceptable to God or the Torah. Lenny and Sarah go back to their rabbi, and he tells them that there are only two possible actions at this point. There needs to be a solid resolution. Either they can decide to dissolve the marriage immediately, regardless of Sarah's guilt or innocence, or they can choose to re-establish a trusting relationship based on Lenny's acceptance of his wife's innocence. Lenny and Sarah love each other, and they don't want to split up. But how can Lenny trust Sarah now? She insists that she's innocent, but there's no way to prove what really went on after they went into that hotel. There's no way for Lenny to dispel his lingering doubts. Their marriage seems doomed. But then the rabbi suggests a solution. There was a witness to what happened in the hotel. God. Sarah's innocence can only be attested to by God himself. How, they ask? So the rabbi tells them about the Sotah ritual. Let's take a step back and look at what we've learned so far. Far from being a case where an angry husband drags his unwilling wife's name through the mud and puts her on trial, the Sotah ritual is only done in cases where both partners are seeking reconciliation and both of them want to reestablish a trusting relationship. A woman can't be forced to perform the ritual to prove her guilt. It's actually the opposite. The Sotah is requested by the wife in order to prove her innocence. Let's get back to Lenny and Sarah. The couple go to the temple, and the priest instructs them on how to perform the Sotah ritual. This is a highly symbolic ceremony, and every element and action has a deeper meaning. First, the husband has to bring an offering for his wife to demonstrate that they are participating in a mutual effort towards reconciliation. A typical offering would be wheat with oil and incense, but the Sotah offering is barley with no oil and no incense. The symbolic meaning behind this is that we offer barley instead of wheat because barley is animal food. And marital infidelity is such a terrible sin that it lowers us to the level of animals. Oil and incense are representative of the joy and blessing we receive when we sacrifice to God. In the Sotah offering, we exclude these because adultery brings no joy or blessing to anyone, including God. Next, the priest takes a clay jar and fills it with water from the sanctuary watchman and dust from the sanctified earth on which the temple stands. Talmud teaches that the clay jar represents the human body, which was formed from the earth, and the holy earth and water poured into the jar represents the life-giving potential of our bodies. The ritual reminds us that sex and reproduction are meant to be holy, and when sex is misused in adultery and marital infidelity, the things that were meant to bring blessing and joy instead turn bitter and becomes a curse. Finally, the priest writes down the two possible consequences of the Sotah test. If Sarah has been unfaithful to Lenny, the water will turn bitter inside her and cause all kinds of yucky stuff to happen. But if she is telling the truth and has been faithful, the water will not harm her and she will be blessed with fertility and bear children. Sarah then has to voluntarily agree to the terms of the test. If she doesn't agree, the whole test becomes invalidated. Finally, the priest places the parchment into the jar, and the writing becomes dissolved into the water. And then comes the moment of truth. Sarah stands before the priest and has her hair uncovered and let loose over her shoulders. It sounds unnecessarily humiliating, but the rabbis argue that this isn't done as a punishment. If it were, they would have done it in public where everyone can see, like in the Scarlet Letter. Instead, she loosens her hair only when she's sequestered with her husband and the priest, as a symbolic representation of her vulnerability and dependence on the mercy of God. Right before she partakes in a test that may claim her life, she removes her head covering, the symbol of a married woman, and in doing so, symbolically removes herself from the protection of her husband. He can't help her now. She stands alone before God, and only the Holy One can judge her. Sarah holds up the bowl to her lips and tilts it back. At that moment, Lenny realizes that this has all been a huge mistake. He realizes he doesn't care what Sarah may or may not have done. She is the love of his life, and he can't imagine life without her. He doesn't need some crazy test to tell him that he wants to be with her forever. Lenny leaps to knock the bowl from Sarah's hands, but it's too late. She's already drunk the waters. Lenny stands back, motionless, unable to even breathe, as he waits to see what will happen to his wife. After a moment, Sarah grimaces and says, "That tasted awful, but otherwise, I feel pretty good." Lenny bursts into tears of relief, and he rushes to embrace his wife. Sarah has passed the test. She has proven herself a faithful woman, and the trust between her and her husband has been restored. So what happened here? Is a Sota test magic? The truth is, Sarah was never in any danger at all. The water she drinks, while dirty, is completely harmless by itself. Earlier, I compared the Sota to a medieval trial by ordeal. But that's a misconception. In a trial by ordeal, the defendant is presumed to be guilty, and God would have to perform a miracle to prove his innocence. The Sota is actually the opposite of an ordeal. In the Sota, the wife is presumed to be innocent, and God would have to come down and perform a miracle in order to prove her guilty. At no point in the whole process is the woman forced to do anything against her will. According to Jewish law, if Lenny demanded the test and Sarah didn't want to do it, she always had the option to ask for a divorce instead. In fact, since there was no evidence that she had committed adultery, the divorce would have been considered no fault, and Lenny would have to pay her alimony. The Sota test can only be taken voluntarily, and only an innocent woman would agree to it. If Sarah had really been unfaithful, she almost certainly would have taken the option of divorce rather than face the dire consequences of the test. Only a woman who still genuinely loves her husband and wants to restore his trust in her would have the courage and faith in God's justice to take the test. Sarah and Lenny have been reunited, and as they leave the temple, the situation couldn't be more different than the Scarlet Letter. When Sarah entered the temple, her reputation was in shambles. Her friends, family, and co-workers wondered if she was an unfaithful wife and thought less of her for it. But when she emerges from the temple, whole and unharmed, hand in hand with her husband, she is vindicated before the whole community. Both her reputation and her relationship with her husband have been restored. Soon after, according to God's promise, she and Lenny conceive their first child and continue on in their journey together. I love a happy ending. The Sota is the only case of social law in all of Torah that God thinks is so important that he directly intervenes in our affairs. In every other case, God tells us to rule among ourselves according to his laws. But when a marriage is threatened, God himself steps down from his throne and comes down to deal with it personally. God's involvement in the Sota test demonstrates the level of his presence in every marriage. The union between a husband and wife and their faithfulness towards each other is the special object of God's attention. How much more should we value that relationship ourselves? Shalom and thanks for watching. If you like this video, please make sure to subscribe. And don't forget to visit simchatyisrael.org to learn more. Shalom.